in the air when the judge gave his order. A separate deportation flight took off after the order as well. At the White House today, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt insisted the deportation was legal on a technicality that these deportation flights were already in the air at the time of the judge's order and therefore outside the court's jurisdiction. Leavitt also suggested that the White House was preparing to argue in court that the judge's ruling from the bench was not binding.
This administration acted within the confines of the law, again, within the president's constitutional authority and under the authority granted to him under the Alien Enemies Act. We are quite confident in that, and we are wholly confident that we are going to win this case in court. All of the planes that were subject to the written order, the judge's written order, took off before the order was entered in the courtroom on Saturday, and the administration will, of course, be happily answering all of those questions that the judge poses in court later today.
Now, this comes as the administration is also facing scrutiny for deporting a professor at Brown University Medical School, denying that it willfully disobeyed a court order against her removal. It also comes as the president pushes the limits of his authority in other ways, threatening January 6th committee members with prosecution while arguing that the preemptive pardons that former President Biden issued had been voided. Joining me now from the White House, NBC's Gabe Gutierrez, Julia Ainsley, and John Allen are here with me on set. And Boston University School of Law professor Robert Tsai is with us as well. Gabe, I'll start with you here. How is the White House justifying these deportation flights despite the judge's order halting them?
Hi there, Aaron. Good afternoon. Well, the White House has had an evolving explanation for this. We've heard today from Border Czar Tom Homan saying that once the aircraft is out of American airspace, quote, it is what it is, essentially furthering that argument that once it's outside of, U.S. jurisdiction, that this court, the judge's order didn't apply to it. But on the other hand, we've also heard from Caroline Leavitt today saying that the administration did follow the written order. However, it is, of course, the verbal order that is raising even more questions, and the judge saying that this plane should have turned around. Well, as you just mentioned, Caroline Leavitt and the White House seem to be making the argument that it is the written order that supersedes. But I think, Aaron, we should look at this more broadly. The administration is really taking a look at whether the judiciary branch is a co-equal branch of government here. We just heard a few moments ago from Stephen Miller trying to make the argument that one federal district judge should not be able to decide policy, and it should be that the White House and President Trump that was elected by the American people. So this is an argument that the White House really seems eager to be having, and we expect to play out at this hearing this afternoon and really over the next couple of months and years of this presidency here.
For sure. I'll come back to you in a second here, Gabe. Julia, I want to turn to you. The Alien Enemies Act. So many questions here. Help us understand what exactly this act is, why the president wanted to use it, and why the judge in this case wanted to temporarily block the White House from using this act.
Well, it goes back to the 18th century, and it's only been used during wartime, in the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II, when it was used as justification for the internment here in the United States of Japanese Americans. And in this case, what it's allowed Trump to do, or what they think it should allow him to do, is to summarily deport individuals because of their nationality, or in this case, because they think that they belong to this gang, Tren de Aragua. And as I'm told by people inside the administration and outside, who are outside observers, what it looks like to them is that Trump wants to use this act right now in a very specific and targeted way, so that he can have this conversation where the American people are thinking, why would any judge, why would anyone want to stand in the way of deporting gang members, and then perhaps be able to widen this later. If he's successful here in court or at another level in court, perhaps he could widen it to start deporting, say, whole nationalities of people without going through the judicial system or the immigration court system. And in this case, we understand those who were deported did not have final orders of removal, and the rap sheet of crimes that Caroline Leavitt laid out today, she mentioned kidnappings, child exploitation, prostitution, assault of a police officer. All of those things, I understand, they were not convicted of, they're merely charged with. But what it really comes down to is they were deported without a hearing.
So one of the questions is about the timing of all this, right, and how this all played out. So what do we know about the specific timing of these flights to El Salvador versus when the judge's order came down?
Well, we understand that there was one plane that had already landed by the time they were having this emergency hearing on Saturday night. And so what was in question is legal learn of the ACLU stood, or rather video conference with Judge Boasberg, were two flights that were in the air. Really kind of a Hollywood scenario here, trying to argue that these two planes needed to be turned around. And Judge Boasberg told the lawyer for the Justice Department, Drew Ensign, in no uncertain terms that those planes were to be turned around, or they needed to do whatever they had to do to bring those people back to the United States, because they were not yet in the hands of Salvadoran law enforcement. At that point, they're outside of his control. And the lawyer said that he completely understood that and he would direct federal agencies to act accordingly. Now, it wasn't until another 30, 40 minutes that that written order came out. That's the one Caroline Levitt's pointing to. That did not talk about planes turning around, but it's going to be really hard to see how they piece this apart and whether or not they can get Judge Boasberg to agree that his oral order was meaningless, especially after we've seen them call his order unlawful. Right. Stephen Miller degrading the order. It's really different from what you usually see when an administration responds to a court order.
So I want to play something here. Actually, you know what? Let's turn back to Gabe Gutierrez at the White House for us now. Gabe, we know that the president has expressed some frustration at the pace of deportations since he took office. Is this latest move really part of that frustration?
Well, this is part of an ongoing series of actions that the president and the administration has been taking to increase the pace of deportations. You remember, Aaron, just a short time ago, there was a lot of talk about Guantanamo Bay, and the migrants that were there were abruptly moved out of Guantanamo Bay, even though the administration says that it insists that it will continue using Guantanamo Bay. Well, this is the next step. And there have been issues with detention space in the U.S., and the administration views this as a win-win. They can take these alleged gang members outside of the U.S. to a friendly country, El Salvador. And today, the administration said that it is paying them $6 million in order to house these alleged gang members. So, yes, Aaron, this is a continuation of the administration's deportation plan. And there has been frustration that the plan hasn't been going as quickly as they'd like. But, of course, that is due to a variety of factors, including money and the fact that ICE and federal agencies are in need of it in order to continue this unprecedented mass deportation plan. But this has been something that the administration has been considering for quite some time, and now they're putting it into action. And as you can tell by looking at that video that was pre-produced, again, we don't know by who, but they want these images out there of these alleged gang members being taken into custody in handcuffs and being sent to prison.
Well, John, let me turn to you here. Are there any legal questions about deporting migrants to a country that is not the country that they're from, to their native country? We're talking about Venezuelan gang members allegedly here being taken to El Salvador and a super prison there.
Yes, there are legal questions about that, and I'm not a lawyer, but I can read. And we're watching right now a major assault by the Trump administration on the other branches of government. You can expand it not just the judiciary, but also the legislative branch, the Congress, and basically the Trump administration saying, we are the law. The president himself, in fact, saying the other day before correcting himself and saying, we're the law, he said, I'm the law, to the governor of Maine. I think the immediate question here was whether these people could be deported, as Julia said, without any due process, right? I mean, this is a huge part of our legal framework, and really the legal framework of any democracy is to have due process for people who are accused of things. You mentioned the video. Gabe mentioned the video before. The video is put out there to create a presumption of guilt. And I'm not saying that everybody in that flight is guilty or isn't guilty, but there's an idea here that all of them are guilty. They've all been deported. Yeah. It's saving the country, and they should be denied due process. And that's the thing that's going to be dealt with first here.
So I want to play some video here. Caroline Levitt referred to these migrants as terrorists in part of her remarks today. Watch this.
Tren de Aragua is now a designated foreign terrorist organization. And as I said, there were nearly 200 Tren de Aragua members who were sent to El Salvador this weekend. Countless lives will be saved because of this action. And if you talk to the families, the Angel families, as I mentioned, Blake and Riley and Jocelyn Nungray, they understand the grave cost of life at the hands of these illegal terrorists. And the president is proud to deliver on that promise for them.
So, John, is this argument about national security part of the justification for these these particular deportations?
Yeah, look, national security has always been used as a justification to bend or break or change or exploit the laws that exist, whether that's interning Japanese Americans during World War II or for other reasons. And it does not mean that Carolina is wrong about that. I don't know who these people are. Julia's here. I don't believe we've gotten a list of names. So it makes it very difficult to determine whether there's a national security threat, whether you are a reporter, whether you're an American citizen, whether you're really anybody watching this go on. I suspect that most of the people that they deported are members of or are involved with that gang, but we just simply don't know. And everybody, certainly all the citizens in this country have a right to be named and have, be charged and have a due process, and even green card holders will have that. So, again, I think that's really the first thing that has to be resolved here is, are these people going to have a process?
Julia, you want to jump in?
If I could say that, I've been reporting on this gang for almost a year now. The first thing I was told by the NYPD deputy commissioner is that the way they tie people to this gang is through tattoos. Some of them are unusual. They have a lot of Michael Jordan tattoos, clowns, clocks. Some of them are roses. But since when in a court of law does someone get convicted because they have a rose tattoo?
Right.
These are the kind of loose things that we're able to do to connect people to a group, regardless of whether or not they do have an affiliation or they've committed a crime.
But you ultimately need more. And in a courtroom, you would get more if you were to go through full due process. Gabe, I do want to ask you one more thing before we let you go here. The president is also suggesting that the pardons of former President Biden's, the ones he signed for these former January 6th committee members, is void because Biden may have used an auto pin to sign those pardons. Have we seen any evidence that this administration, the Justice Department in particular, is looking to take this argument seriously?
No, there is no indication that it's really unclear where this goes from here, whether there will be any sort of formal investigation. But the president doesn't have the authority. There is no legal mechanism in order to revoke a pardon. And while we haven't heard from the Biden administration at this point, you'll remember at the time, Aaron, that the president, when he did preemptively pardon his family members, also members of the January 6th committee, he did issue a written statement. And yet President Trump is still trying to make that argument, has been talking about it over the last several days on social media, that somehow President Biden did not realize and did not know that he was issuing these pardons, that there were other people in the administration. But we should point out the use of auto pens is not without precedent. President Obama used it at least twice to sign a bill. It has been in use. The earliest known use of it, I believe, is Thomas Jefferson. Also in the 1950s, it was used for other sorts of presidential declarations, but not signing a bill, more like personal cards. Bottom line is, Aaron, is that we don't know where this goes from here, but it does seem to be a way for President Trump online and social media to sort of rile up his base, and then also to raise questions, however unfounded, of President Biden's mental capacity.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. Gabe, Julia, John, appreciate you all today. Thanks so much. Professor Tsai, if I can turn to you now, is the Trump administration's argument about this deportation flight that it was no longer in U.S. territory, is that a sound one?
Well, much depends on what we'll learn at this hearing that's coming up. It's not as simple as a yes or no question. We do know that if there was proper jurisdiction in the court, the government can't just evade jurisdiction by playing games. So once the court asserts that it has jurisdiction, then we'll have to figure out what was learned at what point. It sounds from the reporting that there was, in fact, a promise to turn those planes around, any planes that were in the air. And so we'll just have to wait and see. If, in fact, what we learn is that the Trump administration knew about the order and they, in fact, defied the order, then we'll be in a very different place than we were even just a couple of days ago. We will have kind of be in a situation where, for the first time, we have open defiance of a court order. So I think we'd be in a very different place.
So a couple of things here. Some people who aren't lawyers would ask, when is a judge's order actually effective? When does it go into effect? And then what happens if there are differences between what the judge says out loud while he's sitting on the bench and what is in a written order?
There's no difference between what the judge says orally and what is written, as long as there's no significant departure between the two. Judges issue orders all the time from the bench orally, especially in cases like this when time is of the essence. Now, because the rule of law requires an orderly process, once the judge's order is entered, that's considered a valid order. And if the government doesn't agree with it, then they need to follow proper protocol to appeal, which they did. And until that appeal is resolved, that order stands.
As a practical matter, though, is there a distinction or an issue to be made of the idea that a judge gives an order and the lawyer needs time to transmit that order? In this case, going from the courtroom to the cockpit of an airplane, if that takes 30 or 40 minutes, would that be in violation of a judge's order to do something immediately?
Certainly, these things kind of happen where you could have misunderstandings. And that will come out in the course of this hearing, right? This is why you put people under oath. You ask them questions about what they knew when, and certainly the judge is not going to rush to, order or put anybody under contempt citation without finding that there is a willful effort to defy, his order. So yes, the accidents happen.
Yeah. Before I let you go, I do also want to ask you about this idea that former President Biden's pardons of the January 6th committee members are void because he used an auto pin. Is there any legal argument that one president can take back the pardons that have been issued by a previous president?
On the subsequent question you raised, there's absolutely no basis to assert that a successor president can simply invalidate a previous president's pardon.
All right. That's pretty direct and pretty simple. Professor Robert Tsai, we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Coming up, Democrats in crisis and warning signs for the White House. Steve Kornacki is at the big board with the top takeaways from our brand new NBC News poll. Plus, with Democrats at a crossroads, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer facing backlash from members of his own party. That's after last week's government funding deal. We are live on the Hill with the latest fallout. You're watching Meet the Press now. Turning now to a sorely divided Democratic Party in Washington, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer facing backlash from his own caucus for letting a stopgap funding bill pass the Senate on Friday, avoiding a government shutdown. A number of Democrats publicly venting their frustration over the weekend, including Congressman Mark Takano, who said, quote, Chuck Schumer is supposed to be the leader of the opposition, not a rank-and-file member of the GOP. And Congresswoman Norma Torres posting, Senator Schumer betrayed us all. Amid words of planned protests, Senator Schumer is now postponing his book tour, citing security concerns. He and House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries met over the weekend after Jeffries dodged questions on Friday about whether he thinks Schumer should be ousted from leadership. On Meet the Press yesterday, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy told Kristen that he backs Schumer as caucus leader, but he wants to see a change in strategy.
Do you think that Leader Schumer is the best person to lead your caucus in this moment?
Senator Schumer certainly can lead this caucus.
Is he the best person?
He can lead this caucus, but we need to have a conversation inside the caucus about whether we are willing to stand up to Republicans.
Just yes or no before we move on. Do you have confidence in Leader Schumer?
I still support Senator Schumer as leader, but I think the only way that we are going to be effective as a caucus is if we change our tactics.
NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor is on Capitol Hill with us today. So, Sahil, we've heard a lot of critical words from Democrats that have been directed at Chuck Schumer. How is he defending himself at this point?
Hey, Aaron. Well, Schumer has maintained that he did the right thing. He has continued to carry that argument for himself in his floor speeches Thursday and Friday, in a gaggle with reporters in the midst of all of that mayhem, and in interviews ever since he cast that decisive vote to let this bill move forward. It is now law. It is signed into law by President Trump. The government stays open through September. Schumer argues that this was the Hobson's choice, that Democrats didn't really have a choice other than to keep the government open, because he argued a shutdown would play into the hands of President Trump, his administration, Elon Musk, and their attempts to dismantle the federal government, and it would be conservative hardliner Russ Vought, the OMB chief, who got to decide which federal employees were essential and non-essential employees. He also argued that there was no off-ramp. On the flip side, many Democrats are angry at his decision because they believe that this leaves them in a worse position, that Democrats weren't at the table for this bill. They argue it contains a bunch of, billions of dollars really in cuts to domestic programs that Democrats prioritize, a boost in funding for military programs that Republicans prioritize. And they say this sets a precedent for Republicans to simply steamroll Democrats, given that Schumer didn't get anything in return for providing those crucial votes, Aaron.
Well, we know that Schumer also met with Hakeem Jeffries this weekend after the House Democratic leader wouldn't publicly support his leadership on Friday. Do we know anything about that meeting over the weekend, Sahil?
Only that it happened, Aaron. We did not get a readout from either Schumer's office or Jeffries' office about the content of what they discussed. But it really is a remarkable moment. These two have been joined at the hip strategically ever since Hakeem Jeffries elevated to a Democratic leader a few years ago. And they're both Brooklyn Democrats. They've both been highly supportive of each other. They both praised each other repeatedly. The fact that they're so deeply at odds about this shows the level of miscommunication between the two of them. It's very clear that Hakeem Jeffries, when he unified the House Democratic caucus to oppose this bill, wanted and expected Schumer and Democrats to stand with them to filibuster it. It looks like Schumer, from what I gather, had a different sense of what they had agreed to, that he expected this Democratic unity to work in terms of stopping the bill in the House. And once it came to the Senate, Schumer believed they didn't really have much of a choice.
So, Sahil, just a few seconds left here, but I wonder where things settle now. Is this divide in the Democratic Party right now really over tactics, and is a change in the offing?
It's certainly over tactics. It's over strategy. It's how to take on President Trump. There's no indication that this is waning anytime soon. This is a deep division within the Democratic Party. For the most part, senators have not called on Senator Schumer. Well, I should say we don't know a single senator who's called on Schumer to step aside in the Democratic Party. They're mostly having a collegial debate about tactics. But on the outside, there is one prominent progressive group called Indivisible that is asking Schumer to step aside. Take a look at this statement from that group. It says, quote, Senator Schumer has contributed and led many important accomplishments that Indivisible is grateful for, but they argue with the democracy on the line, he let us, the country, and the Democratic Party down. They say he should step aside as leader. Now, Aaron, there's interesting data in the recent NBC poll showing that from 2017, this same moment in Donald Trump's presidency, early on, there was a wide desire for compromise with the president among Democratic voters. Now, that same question was posed. Overwhelmingly, they say by a 33-point margin, they want Democratic members to hold the line, to fight, and not compromise with President Trump. This could be a potential Tea Party moment for the Democratic Party in terms of anger from their own base that they're not being aggressive enough against the administration.
Indeed. We're going to talk about that in this polling a little bit more here. Sahil Kapoor for us on the Hill. Thank you, sir. Well, the challenges facing Democrats in Washington come as their party brand is faltering across the country. Our new NBC News poll had just 27% of respondents with positive feelings toward the Democratic Party. That is the lowest number we've recorded for the Democratic Party in NBC News polling dating back to 1990. NBC News national political correspondent Steve Kornacki is at the big board now with some of the numbers from our new polling here. So, Steve, I want to start with the Democrats, if we can here, and their new low in our poll. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, put that what you just showed in contrast with the Republicans. Now, look, neither party, when you ask folks about them, is really popular right now. The Republicans are underwater, 39 positive, 49 negative. They're only 10 points underwater. As you said, the Democrats right now, barely 1 in 4 voters say they have a positive view of the Democratic Party, an outright majority negative, 28 points underwater. Again, that's almost 3 times as underwater as the Republican brand is. And then you mentioned it, too, just the history here. This is the NBC poll going back here to the 1990s, and you're seeing how each party on this image question has fared through the years. And you see that range. There were some positive scores there back in the 90s, in the aughts. It's been negative for both parties for a while, but this is what's happened since the election. The number has just fallen off the cliff for Democrats to be 28 points negative. And you don't see any number for either party going nearly this low. Again, going back 3 decades there in this poll. Now, so what that means is, obviously, a lot of Republicans and independents, for that matter, don't have have a negative view of Democrats. A lot of Democrats do, too. And this gets to what Sahil was just talking about there. This is what he referenced. This from our new NBC poll here, asking Democrats what should their party party in Congress be doing? Compromising to try to get consensus, sticking to positions. And as Sahel said, here's that reversal. In 2017, early on Trump's first term, nearly 60% were on the compromise side. That's fallen almost in half. Meanwhile, doubled the number saying stick to positions, dig in. Another question we asked, we don't have it here, but I can tell you, Democrats who believe their party in Washington is being too cooperative with Donald Trump. There are a fair number of Democrats who hold that view. They're a minority, but it's a fair number in our poll. The overwhelming majority of those Democrats say they have a negative view of their own party.
Well, Steve, let's turn to Donald Trump now, the president, if we can here. Our first look at his standings in our poll since he took office this second time. What are they showing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways to look at it. So let's put this up on the screen here. Overall, the approval rating for Trump sitting at 47%, 51 disapprove. So you could say this. You could say, hey, compared to every modern president just coming to office at this same point, about 2 months in, I mean, here you go. Obama, George W. Bush, Biden, Clinton, they all had majority approval at this point. Donald Trump's number here, the lowest, the only one not to have majority approval. By historical standards, this is a very low number for Trump, but Trump's a bit of a different political creature, we've been saying, and compared to his own standard, this is where he was at the start of his first term in 2017. This 47% number now, obviously much higher than 2017 and really higher than just about anything he did during his first term as president when it came to the approval rating. So for Trump, by his own standards, that's high. And I think what that suggests is it's not that he's built new support since the election, but the coalition that elected him last November, you're not seeing yet any big defections from that for him to be sitting there at a 47% job approval rating. One thing powering that, we asked on some of the issues here how he's doing. This is probably his most popular area, the border, immigration. Outright majority approve of what Trump's done. That means there are folks who don't approve of Trump in his overall handling of the presidency who do like what he's doing on immigration and the border. The trouble, though, for Trump is right here. Economy, inflation, arguably the two issues that got him elected. A majority in each case now disapprove of how Trump is handling the economy and inflation. And this is a reversal from his first term as well, because he had generally bad numbers overall his first term. The economy was always the exception. It was his strong suit in his first term, and now it's a completely different story. And so I think the threat that emerges, the potential threat for Trump's political standing is if these numbers don't improve, if folks don't, if the perception of where the economy is doesn't improve, that could spell trouble for Trump politically.
All right, Steve Kornacki at the big board. Thank you, sir.
Got it.
We have much more on the fallout from our poll straight ahead. The panel is up next. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. As our friend Steve Kornacki just mentioned, President Trump facing some mixed reviews early in his presidency, but his standing is being buttressed by sky-high numbers among Republicans. Take a look at some of the numbers here. This is his approval rating on the economy. Overall, 44% approve of his handling of that issue. It is the lowest number he's ever had in our poll. But when you break it down by party, 84% of Republicans say they approve of the president's handling of the economy, compared to just 25% of independents and 4% of Democrats. Joining me now, Tia Mitchell, Washington bureau chief for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Cornell Belcher, Democratic pollster and NBC News political analyst, and Republican strategist Doug Heye. A lot to dig through coming out of the weekend here, guys. So, Tia, I'll start with you here. A pretty big gap as we look at the economy numbers from this particular polling. What do you take away from some of the numbers we've seen in this poll?
I know, ironically, I think his numbers, even on Republicans, are kind of low, where you, knowing how universally he's supported by his party, that there's still a little bit of a gap there. But of course, what's more concerning is those independents. 3 out of 4 independents do not approve of how Donald Trump is handling the economy. And we know that that was the #1 issue, particularly for independents. I think there were other issues at play for the partisans, but those independents really did trust his messaging on the economy. So the fact that they don't necessarily think he's making good on that, I think is a problem.
So, Cornell, I ask you to look at some of these numbers, too, as we dig through and we see 44% believe the country is heading in the right direction with this huge gap in parties like we talked about. Is this how do you read the numbers here? Do you believe that 44% is the Republican group there sort of overinflating these numbers on reality? Should we be looking at independents?
Well, I won't say it's overinflating. Look, if you look at the data, the president does have problems on the economy. And look, it's falling behind, right? He ran on the economy, and if you look at he's now underwater with the economy. If you go back to earlier NBC polls, he's always had a more approving than disapproving on the economy. That's collapsing is problematic for not only the president, but I think it's really problematic for House Republicans. On the other side, you do see Republicans standing with him in a way that you see Democrats not standing with. And all this sort of talk about the Democratic Party right now, the really low levels of support for the Democratic Party, there's not 4% difference between where independents see, negatively the Democratic Party and Republicans, they're negative on the Republican Party among independents. Republicans are much more likely to be saying that they are still positive of the Republican Party than Democrats are. And if you look at younger voters, the Democrat Party is now underwater with younger voters in a way that we just didn't see them underwater with younger voters back in the Obama era. And so core parts of the Democratic Party, and you see that playing out right now with Schumer, core parts of the Democratic Party are really turning an angst about what's happening with the Democratic Party and don't think they're fighting hard enough.
Well, Doug, let me ask you here. I want to put some more numbers up on the screen. 74% of Republicans have very positive feelings toward President Trump compared to 50% around this time in 2017. Does this really tell the story, do you think, of his first 2 months in office here? Very little appetite among Republicans to go against, to defy President Trump this time around?
I think it tells the story of the past few years as well. If we go back to January 7th of 2017, or excuse me, of 2021, very different atmosphere for Donald Trump within the Republican Party, certainly within the Senate and the House conferences as well. So Trump has been able to resurrect himself, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that he can walk on water. And I think the economic numbers are one of the reasons why. And I'd say there are two reasons for that. One is everywhere you go, people are paying too much for everything. We all do that. We all know that. We see it every day in our lives. The other is think of all the things that Donald Trump talks about on a daily basis that don't affect that. Whether it's auto pens or some other crazy issue that nobody's really talking about except him. Yeah. Egg prices have fallen. We've talked about eggs for weeks and weeks. Eggs have fallen every week for the past 4 weeks. I'd have Donald Trump talking about that. He did so well when he went to that fast food restaurant during the campaign. I'd send him to a grocery store, have him buy some eggs.
Given the fact that he can't run again, do these numbers mean anything to him at all as he's thinking about what he's doing and what he's talking about or not talking about?
They do for two reasons. One, the independents clearly show there's some vulnerability, and that gets to what Cornell, I think, rightly said earlier, House Republicans.
Yeah. Tia, we do need to talk about Democrats a little more here. I mean, looking at some of the numbers, low numbers for Democrats here, an all-time low in this particular poll. What are they doing? How did they get to where they are?
Well, they got to where they were by trying to be a big tent. And I think what we saw, particularly during the presidential campaign and just the midterm elections, is the Democratic big tent has so many factions that want their leaders to agree with them on their issue, and you can't please everyone all of the time. And whereas we see Republicans are more likely to say, we're going to fall in line. We might not like everything Donald Trump does, but he's our guy and we're going to stick with them. Democrats said, hey, Kamala Harris or Chuck Schumer, I don't like where you're at on this issue, even if I like where you're at on many other issues. And now I'm ready to fight you on this. And that's what we're seeing. So Democrats are really having a hard time keeping their coalition together. They're having a hard time creating a message that everyone can rally around. And they're having a hard time figuring out who is going to be the leader of the party, who is going to be the one who we say, this is our standard bearer, and we can get behind them.
So, Cornell, let me ask you a little bit more about that, then, this idea of who's going to be the leader, what they do. Steve Kornacki pointed out some interesting numbers. In 2017, Democrats wanted their lawmakers to compromise. Now they want them to stick to their positions. I keep thinking about Michelle Obama saying, when they go low, we go high. And it seems as though there's an appetite now for Democrats to take off the white gloves and put on some brass knuckles and take the fight in.
Look, what you're seeing in these numbers are no more than the aftermath of what you saw in the last presidential election, where you had roughly 5 million people who voted Democrat in 2020 simply not turn back out, right? You're seeing that reflected here right now. There is a mobilization and a real sort of core issue around Democrats, sort of what they stand for and whether or not they will fight. Part of the reason, and look, from a governing standpoint, I'm going to be one of the few people who are going to stand up for Chuck Schumer on the news today. From a governing standpoint, and I read his op-ed, from a governing standpoint, what he did does make sense from a governing standpoint. From a political standpoint, it was a nightmare. From a political standpoint, you notice if you're arguing process, you're losing the message, right? So I do understand what he's saying from a governing standpoint, but they simply want to see Democrats stand up and fight. And look, I sat in enough focus groups over the last year and a half, 2 years, where especially with these young voters, they don't know what the Democrat Party really stands for, whether or not they'll fight. There's no one issue, right? And there's no one message that's going to fix this, right? I went to work for a guy by the name of Howard Dean in 2004 when your guys won everything and Karl Rove was talking about a permanent Republican majority. You know what we did then? Under Howard Dean, we came in and we went to work in the states. We went to work taking power and all this sort of conversation out of Washington, back to the grassroots, and you've got to get back to party building and grassroots. It's not about a one simple message. It's about grassroots and touching those voters on a consistent basis around a 50-state strategy the way we did in 2005.
Doug, what's your read on this? I mean, do Democrats, are they done? Do they stand a chance? Is there something the Republican Party needs to be thinking about as they look ahead maybe toward the midterms?
Well, first, let me say I agree with everything that Cornell said. I haven't said that sentence ever before in my life, so I'm happy that I can. But look, I go back to when I was at the RNC in 2010. Mid-2009, the Republicans were declared an endangered species. And the question was, who's the de facto leader? Now, not that today is exactly like back then, but we didn't need a de facto leader. What we needed was something that galvanized our party. That was ultimately Obamacare that got us through. So will Donald Trump give, maybe these economic numbers show that he might, Democrats an opportunity? But they still have to come together. And your previous segment told me all I need to know right now about where Democrats are. A group that calls itself indivisible wants Chuck Schumer to step down. That's a problem.
All right, that's where we will have to leave it for today. Appreciate the discussion. Thank you all, Tia, Cornell, Doug. After the break, U.S. military officials say Russian forces are on the brink of securing a key win against Ukraine's offensive in the Kursk region. NBC News on the ground in Kursk with the very latest on the war there as Presidents Trump and Vladimir Putin prepare to speak to each other tomorrow. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin expected to hold a call tomorrow aimed at reaching a ceasefire agreement in the war in Ukraine. Speaking to reporters yesterday on Air Force One, President Trump said part of that conversation will include, quote, dividing up certain assets. Now, this comes as an NBC News poll shows more than 60% of American voters say their sympathies lie more with Ukraine than Russia in the war. When asked where they believe President Trump's sympathies lie, only 8% say they believe he favors Ukraine. That's compared to the almost 50% who say they believe he sympathizes more with Russia. Joining me now is NBC News Chief International Affairs Correspondent Kirsten Simmons, who is on the ground in the Kursk region of Russia for us tonight. Kier, what are officials in Russia saying about these talks between President Trump and President Putin that we expect to happen tomorrow?
Well, they say they're going ahead, just as President Trump and the Trump administration has said that the call is going ahead. Not much beyond that. Actually, President Trump is giving us more, frankly, than the Russians are. The Russians consistently say they like to hold negotiations behind closed doors. And in a way, that's one of the worries for the Ukrainians, because we've seen now President Trump's envoy have 2 meetings face-to-face with President Putin for a number of hours. He's told us a little bit about what has been said in those meetings, but not that much. And then, as you mentioned, the idea, as President Trump talked about, that they are getting into the detail of dividing up some Ukrainian assets. That's much, much beyond the agreement with Ukraine to hold a 30-day ceasefire. That will worry Ukrainians and some European capitals. I'll just tell you, the feeling here in Russia is continuingly suspicious of the US and President Trump even, but there he is, a picture on the front page of a Russian newspaper. So there is a hope among Russians that there is a change in approach, and I think probably, despite not hearing them overtly say it at this stage, I think probably there's a worry about that from the Ukrainians.
I do want to ask, you're on the front lines there. You've been talking to people and looking around. Set the scene for us there. What's the mood like? Do people want to see a ceasefire? Do they think one's possible?
I think many people's views are hardened by war, inevitably, after many years of war. We spoke to a number of people here in this town of Rilsk, which is in the Kursk region, which is this region where there has been intense fighting between Russians and Ukrainians. It does now look like the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians out of this territory, which is Russian. That's another bargaining chip the Ukrainians have lost. We spoke to people. Many of them said that they wanted to see peace, but on Russia's terms. One woman said, "Peace when we win." Others did say that they are heartbroken by the division between two peoples who, we're very close to the Ukrainian border here, who have lived peacefully together for a long time. So there is a mix of views. There are hardliners too who are urging President Putin to carry on fighting. So I mean, the reality of war is that it does, harden minds, and that's really what you have seen.
Just a few seconds left here, Keir, but beyond the war, is there any other issue you could point to that you would expect President Putin to raise in his call tomorrow?
Oh, I think the Russians would like to see sanctions lifted. I mean, that's going to be a priority for them, as well as, kind of an agreement in terms of territories and assets with Ukraine. All of it is open to question. What we really don't know is what's being said. And I think when we do know that, there may be reactions from the Ukrainians and from the Europeans. This isn't finished yet.
All right, Keir Simmons for us in the Kursk region of Russia there. Keir, thank you. And still to come, tariff tensions, trade wars, the threat of annexation, and the future of America's alliances in the Trump era. The Canadian ambassador to the U.S. joins me here in studio next. You're watching Meet the Press Now.
April 2nd is a liberating day for our country. We're going to be getting back some of the wealth that very, very foolish presidents gave away because they had no clue what they were doing. It's going to be reciprocal. In other words, whatever they're charging, we're charging. Very simple. If they're charging us, we're charging them. It's no longer they charge us and we don't charge them.
That was President Trump reaffirming his stance on tariffs, including the reciprocal tariffs set to take effect next month. This tit-for-tat tariffs and trade policy uncertainty really have been driving recent market volatility and deepening recession fears. Joining me now here on set is the Canadian ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman. Ambassador Hillman, we appreciate you coming in today to talk to us about this. I know you were in the meeting last week with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Can you take us inside the room a bit? Did you get any indications that the conversation there was going to be helpful in trying to tamp down tensions and perhaps remove these tariffs or block the reciprocal tariffs?
Well, thanks, Aaron. Thanks very much for having me. I think that the answer to your question is I think that the administration is moving towards the April 2nd deadline, and there wasn't anything in that meeting that would have suggested otherwise. The meeting was helpful, though, because one of the things that it did was it allowed Howard Lutnick and USTR Greer the opportunity to lay out for us the tariff strategy of the administration for the whole world. We had been talking to them quite a bit already, but really on just Canada-U.S. things. And there they really talked to us about how they plan to have it affect the whole world. And that was useful for us to understand. And we were able to also talk to them about how we really believe that Canada-U.S. trade will help the president, in fact, achieve his economic goals.
So if these tariffs on April 2nd do go into effect and affect Canada more, is Canada going to respond? Is there something that you all have thought about and perhaps decided to put in place if these reciprocal tariffs do, in fact, take effect?
So to date, we have responded to every tariff action with a reciprocal or a response in putting on tariffs of our own. We will see what happens on April 2nd. I think nothing is off the table, but it's really hard to make a definitive statement until we really know what that's going to look like, and we really just don't know yet.
So do the conversations continue? Is there, I think your foreign minister talked about an off-ramp or trying to figure out some way to affect and change what's been happening. Is there any expectation that conversations can continue in a way that would be helpful to change the reality come April 2nd in particular?
I mean, I think there has to be, because the truth is that Canada is the biggest customer of the United States. We buy more from you than any other country on the planet. And these tariffs are hurting American, companies, American workers, American jobs. We have 12 offices across this country, and businesses, small and large, are really talking about how this is affecting their bottom line. And I'm sure that we're going to be able to find a way to make it make sense, because ultimately the administration here, and of course our government in Canada, is going to need to take into account the price at the pump, the price at the grocery store, the ability to buy a new home, all of these things that the tariffs are making more difficult in both our countries.
There was a point where the Trump administration really talked about these tariffs being tied to the flow of fentanyl across the border. And we should note that less than 1% of fentanyl intercepted at the U.S. border comes from Canada. Do you have any degree of clarity on what it would take to roll back these tariffs from the United States? What sort of the administration's end game is here?
I think the tariffs are being used. Different tariffs are have different purposes. I think that the initial set of tariffs was related to border and fentanyl, although Canada leaned hard into that, even though, as you say, we are not responsible for the fentanyl trafficking into the United States. We have a big fentanyl crisis in Canada, too, and the fentanyl precursors are coming from China. But that being said, any bit of fentanyl is too much. And so we were very happy to address any of the issues, all of the issues that the administration had, that the borders had, we have. Beyond that, I think other tariffs are in place for different reasons. Steel and aluminum, those tariffs are in place in order to, according to the president, try to reshore more steel and aluminum production in the United States. And I guess what I would say to that is, being the country that is your biggest steel and aluminum, provider, is that is an objective that, of course, makes sense. But while those factories are ramping up, while those mills are ramping up, which can take a long time, a 25% tariff just makes things a lot more expensive for U.S. manufacturers.
We've heard the president say on more than one occasion that the U.S. doesn't need anything from Canada. He's talked about lumber and cars and things of that nature. What's your response to that very direct statement?
Look, I don't think the evidence would suggest that there are things that we have in Canada, resources, there are minerals, there are energy resources that we have that contribute to U.S. prosperity. About a third of what we sell you is energy. And that energy is, one, keeps the price at the pump low, two, is used for U.S. factories, and also, frankly, some of our crude oil, almost all of it, is refined and then sold to third countries at 3 times the price. So you may not need it, but it certainly does contribute to a vital American economy. I think that what we need to talk about is what exactly are the president's concerns in some of these sectors, because from where we sit, it's a real win-win situation, or even, frankly, just a win situation for the United States, as you are, I think, quite importantly, getting a lot of very strategic goods from us. And if we don't sell them to the U.S., we have lots of other customers, but we'd like to sell them to the United States. You're our neighbor. We want to ensure that all of these strategic products and energy products are here for the American people. I do want to ask you that the OECD cut economic growth, its economic growth outlook for the U.S., for Canada, for Mexico. How much damage could President Trump's policies do to Canada at this point? And is there anything that Canada can do about that? Well, I mean, I think that they will have an effect on Canadian economic performance. They'll also have an effect on U.S. economic performance and, as you say, Mexican economic performance. Of course, there are things we can do, and we are concentrating, indeed, on making sure that we are doing everything for Canadians and the Canadian economy. We are looking at diversifying our markets and selling to other customers that are interested in, free and fair trade. And we are also really looking forward to finding ways to work with our industries to just ramp up Canadian products being sold in Canada. We just have a few seconds left here, but I want to ask you, do you think the United States is still a reliable partner for Canada? I think it can be. I think that right now we are quite unsettled by rules and pacts that we have had that we agreed to, including the most recent trade agreement with President Trump in his first term, being, having the U.S. turn their back on those without a conversation with us. That is very unsettling to Canadian businesses and to Canadians. And I think they are questioning whether or not we can have a resilient relationship with the United States? I believe that we can, but I think it's going to take some time to get back to that kind of place.
All right, we will all be paying close attention. Ambassador Hillman, we appreciate you making time today for us. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
And we are back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but the news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.